A little bit longer for our blue button to become blue. There we go.
Okay, I think we can start. Ali, whenever you say.
Go.
Okay. Hello and greetings.
Longer for our blue button to become blue.
Okay.
There we go. Oh, somebody else has the stream open.
Okay. So hello, everyone, those who are watching us on Zoom and those who are watching us on YouTube. I think we can start. Ali, whenever you say.
Go.
Okay. Hello and greetings.
Longer for our blue button to become blue.
Okay.
Okay, somebody else has the
those who are watching us on Zoom and those who are watching us on YouTube. I can start. Ali, whenever you say.
Nicholas, do you have the stream open on your computer?
Oh yes, probably.
Yeah, maybe turn that off. You're the only one that's not muted right now.
I understand. I'm sorry. Apologies for this. I'm gonna close it. Okay, am I good now?
I believe so.
Now I understand.
But we'll wait to see if there's an echo from my voice.
I understand that I was the source of the problem. Greetings to everyone. I'm Nicholas Prevelakis. I'm Assistant Director of Curricular Development at the Center for Hellenic Studies, also teaching in social studies. I work on political philosophy and also nationalism. I'm honored to be moderating these events. I'm gonna say a few words about that and what it is. This event is part of or a follow-up on the Nights of Philosophy and Ideas, and we're doing this in partnership with the cultural services of the Consulate General of France in Boston, and we have the pleasure of having with us the cultural attaché, Mr. Olivier Favry, whom I can see in the small screen next to me. So thank you, Olivier, and thank you for the French Cultural Services for giving us this possibility once more. Nights of Philosophy and Ideas were first developed in Paris in 2016, and the idea was to really bring people together from the field of philosophy, but not only, to discuss one theme which would be different every year. And it was a huge success when it started, so much so that then it became exported in different other cities in France first, and then all over the world. There's one in particular in the US, which is a huge event every year in New York, Brooklyn Public Library, which typically attracts something like 8,000 people throughout the night to discuss one theme. That theme is the same for all the institutions that decide to partner. It's decided centrally in France, and then it's the same day or the same week. All the institutions that wish to partner organize these night-long conversations. We did the first one in the Boston area last year, and it was done at Harvard, William James Hall. The theme then was being alive. And we had a night-long discussion with, again, philosophers, artists, intellectuals, in the spirit of interdisciplinarity that characterizes us at Harvard, at the Center for Hellenic Studies, the Committee on Degrees in Social Studies, Department of Philosophy, and all the other partner institutions. This year, because of the pandemic, we couldn't do an event in person. The French ministry organized a big worldwide event on January 18th, which you can follow. There's a website, if you Google nightofideas.org, I'll send you the link on chat. We had interesting discussions on proximity and democracy and Tocqueville. The theme that year and this year is proximity. In French, it's proche. Sometimes it's translated in English as closing the distance, which I like less than proximity. I think proximity is an interesting idea. So much so that we decided to explore this theme further and not limit ourselves to this one night, but do a series of events that explore this important notion. Obviously, the reason why this notion was chosen has to do in part with the situation we're currently living, that is the pandemic, and it expresses the hope of togetherness in the post-pandemic world, which we are still waiting and waiting and waiting and doesn't seem to be arriving. But it's also an opportunity to explore this notion and its importance in politics, in ethics, in psychology, in art, in urban planning, perhaps, and see what we can learn from it. The event today is the first of a series of events, and it deals with proximity and politics. Physical proximity, but also proximity as directness. What aspect of proximity is important in politics? What is the connection between proximity and democracy, direct and representative democracy? To what extent and how does democracy need proximity? And then what is the relevance of this notion in general in thinking about politics? To discuss this, we have invited two very dear friends of the center, whom I'm going to introduce right now, Professor Richard Tack of Harvard and Daniela Kamak of Berkeley, to talk about this. So we're going to have short presentations from our two panelists, and then hopefully a discussion with everyone. A short presentation of our speakers. Richard Tack, who is a dear friend and member of the center, is professor of government and a scholar of the history of political thought. He has worked on natural rights, on Hobbes, philosophy and government, specialist on issues of political authority, human rights, natural law, toleration. And recently, I mean, he's published numbers of books, but the last one, which I think is going to be most relevant for the conversation today, is The Sleeping Sovereign, dealing with sovereignty in particular, and sovereignty in government, published in Cambridge University Press in 2016, and we're very honored to have Richard with us. And then Daniela Kamak, who's assistant professor of political science at Berkeley, and who had held multiple appointments at Harvard and published extensively on both ancient and modern democracy, whose dissertation was Rethinking Athenian Democracy in 2013, which won Harvard's Robert Knox Prize for Best Dissertation in Political Science, and who has published multiple articles on political representation in Rome, in ancient Greek democracy, Kratos in Demokratia, and so she can talk to us about democracy, ancient and modern, and the importance of proximity in both. So a few words about the format. So we will start with Professor Tack and then Professor Kamak. In the meantime, if you have questions, please write your questions in the chat. And if you want to speak, raise your hands. After the presentations and a small discussion, we will open the floor to the public. And our dear colleague, Dimitri Halikas, who's himself an expert on Adam Smith and proximity, will make sure to bring questions from the audience so that we can have a discussion with everyone. So many thanks to everyone for this event. Many thanks to our manager, Ali Marbly, who is the mastermind of all these Zoom event, and the reason why we're able to having a conversation in which everyone can see everyone, as opposed to just a webinar where some people are just sitting on the side and watching passively. Thank you again, and Professor Tack, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. Well, thank you, of course, above all, for an invitation to take part in this. And thank you, whoever the genius was who came up with the term proximity. Because, I mean, clearly, as you said, it has an enormous relevance to the way we're living at the moment. But I think it's also got a rather deep relevance to quite fundamental features of politics, and particularly democratic politics. So I was really delighted to be invited to talk about this, and also, of course, delighted to talk about it with Daniela, with whom I've talked about these things now for a long time, and always enjoy our conversations. And this time we're having it in public rather than private. I wanted to begin with some pictures. So if Dimitri, you could put up the first one, if that's going to work. There we, not quite, no. Where are we? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Okay, this says, as you see, Dover 1871. It's a picture of a by-election, actually, in Dover, the city in England, in Kent. It's one of the last elections that took place in England before the secret ballot. That great big sort of barn thing in the background was called the hustings. I mean, and people walked up and registered their vote in public. As you can see, there's a massive crowd. This was the pattern for English elections, and of course for American elections too, although I couldn't find a similar photo. I'm not so impressive about this, the huge numbers of people packed into this marketplace in Dover. This was the pattern, had been the pattern for English elections from the Middle Ages down to 1880, when the first secret ballot election took place in England. The practice actually was, and this is something worth remembering, the practice was first to ask for acclamation, whether a candidate was approved by the crowd or not. And only if one of the candidates complained about the acclamation did they then proceed to a vote, an actual counting of the heads. And it's interesting that Marx, in an essay, expressed some sympathy and enthusiasm for this practice, the practice of taking the vote, the voice, because as he observed, it's a kind of universal suffrage. Anyone who was present could yell, and it wasn't until they actually did the head counting they could work out whether you were entitled to have the vote. Of course, in the 19th century, there's still a property qualification. But for example, women could take part in the voice, they could take part in the shouting, and actually before 1832 in England, they could also take part in the poll if they met the property qualification. So, but what I wanted you to see was, so to speak, was this actual concrete example of proximity, of mass action in the context of an election. So we then move to the second one, Dimitri, let's have a look. Okay, there we are. So that's a sketch of the secret ballot in the first secret ballot election, 1880. So quite a contrast, right? And it's a deliberate contrast. Though you'll see that, interestingly, the artist wanted to make a point about equality, and that's important. You can just read at the bottom something like 10,000 a year, or I think 20 shillings a week are equal this time, right? So you've got the working man just putting in his ballot and the rich man just behind him. But of course, in the old days, the rich man and the poor man would have been side by side in the mass in Dover Marketplace or wherever else they were voting. Perhaps I should add that in the case of the Dover by-election, there was a riot after the election result was announced. So they didn't just mass together to vote, they actually took matters into their own hands in protest at the result. So that's the second one. And as I said, I wanted really to just draw this contrast. Looks very different. This is the world we inhabit. And of course, we're even further from this because we don't merely go into some hall where there are these little booths and sort of secretly and without consultation record our views. We're doing it now online or by post. So we're one step further from the crowd in Dover Marketplace. Just to finish the pictures, I wanted to show you a third one. Okay, there we are. This is illegal because MPs should not do this. But at the time of one of the great Brexit debates, after the referendum, there was one of the debates where there was an enormous vote. I mean, everyone turned up to vote, and someone took a picture illegally in the lobby. Some of you probably know how the House of Commons works, that at the side of the chamber are these corridors, lobbies, and you go into one or other, depending on whether you're voting yes or no, and you surge towards the front to register your vote. So it's exactly the same principle as the Dover by-election. And actually the Commons works in the same ancient way, which is, as you probably know, if you've ever seen Commons on TV, the speaker first yells, he first asks for a shout, and then they go and count. So it's still got that same structure. Notice, incidentally, Boris, just sort of close to the left-hand side, quite a good emblem of democracy. You know, there he is, but he's crammed in with all the other members of the Commons. I mean, that is real proximity, isn't it? Of course, impossible now. Whether it will return, I don't know. I think many MPs want it to return, but who knows? And of course, at the moment, they're voting remotely, or, well, some people are in the chamber, but this whole sense of a crowd actually doing something has gone for now. And it's something obviously we'll want to talk about, I think, as to whether it's going to come back. So those are the three pictures I wanted to begin with, which give you this very graphic picture of different kinds of politics, two different kinds of politics. One, what we might call mass action, which is real mass action. The other, a rather more remote link between what we do and the political outcome. And I think the distinction between these two things is captured not just by these pictures, graphic as they are, but also by mainstream political theory, particularly as it took shape during the French Revolution. Because, of course, as one might expect, that's the formative period for much modern democracy. Not all. I mean, as I said, England has a sort of democratic culture beforehand, but France is where it's fully explored first, really. And I think one can see some of the differences between these two styles of politics in the writings of two some emblematic figures in France. One who was dead before the revolution, that's of course Rousseau, and the other who was alive during the revolution, and indeed quite a long time after it, a very important theorist of the revolution, and someone who has become a really even more important theorist in some ways. In modern political theory, he's been revived and widely studied, and that's the Abbé Sieyès, the author of Qu'est-ce que les tiers états. And I just say something very briefly about this sort of rather stylized difference between them, and then we have to think a bit about, you know, what this tells us about our politics. So first point to make about Rousseau, and this is all very familiar, is that he believed, as we know, in the sovereignty of the people, in the sense that a population has a capacity to determine the fundamental features of its lives. It's important to say it's only the fundamental features for Rousseau. He was perfectly happy to have non-democratic government, as he called it, but he thought the people had to decide directly, otherwise it wouldn't be legitimate, the fundamental conditions, what we might call the fundamental constitution of their society. And they should do this ideally through direct voting in a large assembly, like his own city of Geneva, where the citizens met in the cathedral once or twice a year to vote on legislation, vote in magistrates and so on. But the rest of the year, the council governed Geneva, and there were always a lot of tensions there. Ideally, you'd have that, but Rousseau also thought you could have in a large state, and his example was Poland, which he wrote about, you could capture something of this through mandation from popular assemblies. So there were ways out of the problem that you couldn't all be in one place. It could be like all being in one place if you had popular assemblies locally which mandated the delegates who went centrally, and therefore the delegates would not be able to stray away from the wishes of the people in the local assemblies. Worth observing actually in that context that had been the practice in England. Not infrequently, it wasn't universal, but these assemblies like the one in Dover that we just saw could mandate their MPs. It was rather rare by 1871. It was quite common 200 or 300 years earlier that they would, after electing an MP, they would then take a vote on how the MP should vote when he went up to Westminster. So the practice of mandation was not an unfamiliar one in that large state. So that's the essential Rousseauian thought. We've got to take part, really take part in the construction of our laws, at least the fundamental laws. And we can't be represented in that respect. He kept saying that. It's very familiar thought of Rousseau. Sieyès, on the other hand, was vehemently opposed to anything other than representation. And he linked this, interestingly, with the division of labor, which he thought was a fundamental feature of a modern state. So he says, and I've got a quote in front of me here, he says, the division of labor is in the common interests of all members of society. It applies to political tasks as much to all kinds of productive labor. The common interest, the improvement of the social state itself, demands that we make of government a specialized profession. So a purely democratic constitution, he said, is not merely impossible in a large society, but even in a state of the narrowest extent, it is much less appropriate than a representative constitution. So that's a straightforward pushing back against Rousseau. Even in Geneva, CS thought, you should have representation, because in a modern state, you have division of labor, and you should, so to speak, buy your politicians with votes, or some other way of doing it, just as we buy the services of a plumber. Right? We have very vague sense of what the plumber ought to be doing. We have no involvement in the specificities of what the plumber does. So the Rousseauvian picture, as I said, is one of common action. And he said, he made this clear in a very striking passage, which isn't very well known, where he was defending the social contract, his main book, against critics in Geneva. And he said, talking about making political decisions, it is less a question of deliberation, which CS was to be enthusiastic about, it's less a question of deliberation than of concord. The choice of which course you will take is not the greatest question. Were it bad in itself, take it all together. By that alone, it will become the best. It will become the best. And you will always do what needs to be done, provided that you do so in concert. So he was quite explicit about this. And we could perhaps talk at some point about the quite common view nowadays of Rousseau, that he didn't think that he thought democracy was a means of finding the best outcome. I think I myself think there's very little evidence for that in his text. And what I've just read is a very clear, in a way, denial of that position. The important thing is you do it together. Whereas the Sieyesian picture is one which is not merely represented, it's not merely that we're represented by delegates sent to an assembly, as I said, Rousseau is okay about that, but that there's a more fundamental sense of representation in which the object of the political structure is in some way to represent at the governmental level the views and beliefs and interests of the citizens. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, and Sears, of course, was aware of this and acknowledged it. You don't need universal suffrage if that's your picture of representation. If you can devise a system which will in some way represent, in quite a literal sense, the characteristics of your population, then that's fine. That's better in some ways than universal suffrage. What's the point of universality if you're interested in representation in that sense? And one of the interesting things that's happening at the moment in all our societies is a shift away from voting to what political scientists call sortition, which can be citizen juries, or it can be rather more extravagant ideas that we should, some people have said, even we should choose the American Congress on the basis of a well-planned lottery. I mean, that's to say one where there is a proper attention is paid to the differing social groups and so on that need to be represented. And we can do that, opinion polls do that all the time, they do it quite effectively. So why bother with the universal participation in the vote if that's what politics is supposed to do? So I think, although obviously I'm being very sort of synoptic here, I think that the fundamental Sieyesian picture rather naturally ends up in something like the modern vogue for sortition and the modern move away from the old voting. Now, the problem with this, I think, though, you might think, fine, I mean, that's the purpose of a state, is in some way to represent its citizens, even if the citizens are not taking part in the actual creation of the political situation. But I think there are two problems about this. The first is exactly that we don't take part. I once asked someone who favored this business of a lottery for Congress, what we, the rest of the citizens, should do while waiting to see if we were chosen by lot. And he said, well, you can lobby. That's all you do anyway, he thought. So no difference there. Well, I think it's a very odd psychology. It's very hard to imagine a modern state where we think of ourselves as equal citizens, but only some of us go through having any effect whatsoever, any causal relation to the political outcomes, those who were fortunate enough to be chosen. I think that's a deep problem. There's also actually a more technical problem, which I've come to think about more recently. And I don't want to talk about that too much at the moment, but some of you may know that political theory or political science for the last 50 or so years has been quite transfixed by impossibility theorems, ideas most famously in the work of Kenneth Arrow, about the impossibility in various ways of aggregating preferences. And the different versions of this, the most recent is by Philip Pettit and Christian List. The impossibility here is I think, is of something being fully represented through some political aggregative process, right? That's the sort of assumption behind it. There's something pre-existing, or putting all the individual pre-existing preferences together, we ought to be able to get something which represents a collective outcome. Well, the point about the Rousseauian view is, as it said in the quote I just read, the important thing is we do it together. That is to say, above all, we want to be part of this large group of people moving possibly physically, or possibly to some degree virtually, in a particular direction. It's not a representative act, it's a collective act, right? And that means that the puzzles don't arise, they just vanish. And Arrow himself acknowledged that, actually. He said a Rousseauian attitude to politics would not generate these puzzles because people would change their preferences in the light of what their fellow citizens wish to do in order to secure a collective outcome. And they wouldn't just suppose that the collective outcome had to represent a pre-existing set that couldn't be altered. So there's both a deep psychological problem here, and I think it's a moral problem because it would exclude us from the notion of being active and engaged citizens, and also actually a sort of technical problem about whether a genuinely representative system could actually work under all this political science of from the 1950s down to the present day suggests that it can't. But that's not an argument against democracy. It's an argument against representative democracy. It's not an argument against what you might call active democracy. So I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to say that the emblem of the collective, this mass of people doing things together, though we may not be able to actually create that, though personally I would love it if voting still took place as a sort of mass action on a particular day and so on. People felt they were doing something together. But we may not be able to do that. But at least if we think that what we're trying to do is something that replicates that in our politics, universal suffrage, sense of collective action, then I think we've got something which is a healthier basis to democracy. And so basically what I'm saying is proximity really matters from the point of view of democratic theory. Without proximity in some sense, it may be that we cannot actually have democratic politics.
Thank you, Richard, for this provocative, all-encompassing framework. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to give the floor to Daniela Kamak for her own presentation, then we'll come back for discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Wonderful to see you all. Thanks, Richard, for those very stimulating thoughts, as always. So I'm going to start off in a different place from Richard. But I'm going to end up in essentially the same one. So let me just change my view on here. I suddenly can see myself extremely large, which is not exactly what I want to see. Come back, gallery view. Where is my gallery view? Here we go. There we are. Now I can see you guys. Fabulous. All right. So I'm going to start off with Famous idea from ancient Greek political thought, maybe the most famous idea. Aristotle's claim that a human being is a zoon politikon, a political animal. So by that, I don't think he meant that he thought human beings naturally just love getting involved in politics. I don't think that's what he's getting at all. But rather, he's making the observation that humans, like certain other animals, he mentions ants, bees, and cranes, among others, are the kind of animal that lives in a polis. So what is a polis? Well, in the Politics, Aristotle talked about the human polis as a community initially formed in order to secure bare life, i.e. collective survival, but maintained for the sake of a good life. And it's a very fruitful, fertile thought. But elsewhere, he actually took a different tack. In the Historia Animalium, he talks about the political animal as a kind of animal that engages in a common task, a koinon ergon. So the kind of animal that engages in collective activity, collective action. So this is very, you see, this connects very neatly to the Rousseauvian thought. The point is we do things together, and only by that means do they become successful. So this is the point where I want to begin. So part of our essential nature as a species is that we work together, we depend on one another. Our survival depends on it, our collective flourishing depends on it, our individual flourishing depends on it too. We depend on the collective flourishing to become who we can be as individuals. And I want to suggest that proximity, so specifically being with masses of other people in the same place, helps us to act collectively. So why might that be? I'll suggest two reasons. First, moral support, and second, our realization of the feasibility of an action. So seeing that huge numbers of other people are willing to join us in a collective action both gives us confidence and reassures us that the action is actually possible and therefore worth our committing to it. And in that way only, the possible becomes doable. Now, this is important because there are any number of ambitious goals that we might want to pursue that would require the cooperation of huge numbers of people to be successful. But we are not going to try if we think that we'll be the only ones trying to perform those actions. And it's not because we're lazy or apathetic. It's because, as Richard discusses in his wonderful book, Free Riding, it's because it's true that unless sufficient numbers of other people join us in many actions, there isn't any point in our acting. So for example, lots of potentially desirable actions like storming a barricade or cutting your carbon footprint or voting are not going to have the desired effect unless sufficient numbers of other people also engage in that same action. So seeing that other people are willing to act with us emboldens us. And that seems to me particularly important in political context. That is, I mean, when we're consciously thinking about what we want to do as a community, being with masses of other people with openly shared goals who are willing to act in concert provides us with massive moral support. And that in turn enables us to think bigger and do more and do it better than if we feel ourselves to be and really are isolated, weak, alienated from others and from ourselves. In other words, being with and seeing other people willing to act in concert gives us power, individually and collectively. And by us here, I mean the 99% of humanity that doesn't have much or even any political power or influence as individuals, but does have almost unconquerable power when we act collectively. So the question in brief is something like, when are members of the 99% boldest, most powerful, most indomitable? And the answer I would offer is when we make up a crowd. So Aristotle was very interested in the phenomenon of crowd activity. He thought about it in terms of arete, human excellence or virtue. More people makes more capacity for virtuous and successful action. Aristotle actually took it for granted that large crowds of people, so long as most of them weren't significantly more vicious than your average person, would be more just, more courageous, more temperate, and more sensible than even a single highly just, brave, temperate, and sensible individual or small group. He thought that the crowds were actually much less likely to go wrong, as he put it, and make emotional or unstable decisions. Now that is, of course, not the modern view. Since the late 18th century, at least, we've been told endlessly by political theorists and commentators that crowds are essentially mobs, or at least mobs in waiting. They're unstable, untrustworthy, dangerous. And that's practically a truism of modern democratic politics. And it, perhaps explains why in-person mass politics plays such a small role in modern democracy. So election campaigns, protests, demonstrations, and revolutions can and do gather large crowds, of course, but mass gatherings don't play a significant part in our kind of regular democratic decision-making processes. Instead, as Richard was talking about, we kind of outsource that to these small groups of elected representatives. That is in stark contrast to ancient Greek and Roman democratic politics, which was crowd politics in a very fundamental way. Decisions were made by assemblies of ordinary citizens gathered together in their thousands to vote on decrees, laws, and trials. Hugely important that they had democratic judicial activity as well as kind of legislative and policymaking. Hobbes, with that in mind, actually defined the demos, the people, the demos in demokratia, democracy, as having mass meetings on a regular schedule. So in Hobbes's mind, thinking about ancient Greek democracy, without mass meetings, there was no demos and thus no democracy. That's not to suggest that there was no political elite in, for example, Athens or Rome. There certainly was. Speeches were made, leadership roles were undertaken by an elite few, but decisions were in the hands of the crowd. For example, 6,000 or 8,000 in Athens in the kind of middle of the classical period, perhaps more, meeting 4 times every 40 days and being paid for it. Importantly, they were paid for their time, so they had an actual incentive to be part of the crowd. An actual incentive. There are many incentives, but yeah, they had a pecuniary incentive. In the 330s, the Athenians actually also expanded the space of their assembly meeting place, allowing as many as 13,000 people sitting down or 20,000 people standing up to attend these meetings. So there's something they clearly, they really thought there was something very important about bringing as many people as possible into the decision-making process, making sure there's a real collective investment in the actions that they were going to undertake as a group. I think there's lots of encouraging and potentially liberating things to be learned from the way that the Athenians and the Romans did mass democratic politics. But I want to close by drawing attention to one crucial difference between Athenian and Roman politics with respect to the agency of the crowd. Something that harkens back again to what Richard was just saying about representative and non-representative politics. So the key thing here in my mind is that in ancient Greek democracies, the right to convene the assembly, the right to call the political crowd into being, the right to bring disparate individuals together into a politically empowered mass, able to make policy decisions and law, that right essentially stayed in the hands of the assembly itself. It stayed in the hands of the mass of people. The agenda for assemblies was officially set by the council. That's 500 ordinary citizens, this isn't talking about Athens, 500 ordinary citizens selected by lot among people who volunteered for the service, and they were paid also. So the council set the agenda and was nominally in charge of calling the assembly, but actually the council's hands were tied. They were required by the assembly to call the assembly 4 times every 40 days. And the assembly had also decreed certain items that had to be on their agenda at certain times of the year. So in other words, in ancient Greek democracies, the power to bring the people into political proximity, to make it a collective and fully empowered political agent, always remained in the hands of the collective people, the demos, the assembly itself. Now, things are very different at Rome. The Roman people, the Roman common people, never had the power to convene themselves as an assembly. They always had to be convened by an official, a consul, a senator, or a tribune. The tribunes are particularly interesting because they were actually created as the result of a mass gathering of the plebs, an extra political or kind of a non-procedural gathering of the plebs. So this is the stories of the secessions of the plebs. We hear about the time before the common people had any political power at all. And it kind of impoverished and crushed by debt and constantly being required to join up the army and go and fight. They went on strike. They just pulled out. First just the soldiers and then more people in a second sort of round of secession. So they left under their own steam. They left without a head. Livy notices this. Machiavelli made a lot of it. They left without leadership. They just, of their own accord, formed a mass gathering and departed. And, they didn't have to actually raise a finger. This was clearly the physical force of the crowd was incredibly important. These are soldiers, and the people left in the city were terrified. The elites were terrified that they would make an attack on the city because they would win. They didn't even need to do that. They had this kind of physical power and abeyance. They just waited. And then a kind of emissary came from the senators, and a deal was struck. It was agreed that the plebs would come back. They would continue to enlist in the army in exchange for, this is the important thing, in exchange for having their own political representatives. They did not ask for a role for their own assembly in politics directly. Instead, what they were offered and what they took was the right to have certain representatives of their own elected by themselves who would act as their champions or their protectors. And that gives this very kind of representative shape to Roman democratic politics, to the extent that it was a democracy. It's a slightly different question. But the interesting thing is that the tribunes retained the power to call the crowd. It was incredibly important that they had that power. That was why the tribunes were able to do their job of protecting the common people, was because they were able to call kind of a mob or a crowd together, either to come to the defense of ordinary people who were being oppressed by the Roman nobles, the elite, or to form legislative or judicial assemblies. There was a huge role for legislative and judicial assemblies in Rome, just as there was in Athens. And yet, those people, the common people, could never call themselves into being as a political agent. And now it's a long story, but like my reading of the history of the Roman Republic is that concentration of the power to call the crowd in the hands of officials, and particularly the tribunes, is what basically put an end to kind of popular politics in Rome. It's what put an end to the Roman Republic. That essentially the wishes and desires of the people, for being always channeled through representatives and never able to be voted on themselves directly, is what caused an enormous amount of stasis, and then later led to eruptions of political violence that were not constrained within the kind of regular political processes. And I kind of see the problem of representative politics as partly being that if you don't have an outlet for masses of people to be agents directly, and you don't have ways of holding representatives to account by those masses, you have a problem. I think like this is the thought to end on. It's very significant, not only for us as members of a collective, thinking here about myself as one of the 99%, to feel that we have political agency and to be able to do things through mass action. It's also very significant for speakers and political representatives, members of the political elite, to see. I see that Dimitri is now, can everyone else see this, the picture? It's very important for these representatives or kind of people taking on these leadership roles to be able to see the incredible power of the crowd standing before them. So here, this picture you can see, this is from a kind of mocked up virtual reality construction of what it might have been like to be a speaker in the Athenian assembly. The podium is kind of in front of the speaker. Obviously, that's not the Bema in Athens. That is the virtual reality console that people are using. But you can see what it looks like to be faced with all these people. There is a power, there is an intimidating and threatening power to the crowd. I think it's very important for our political leaders to be faced with that regularly and to be held accountable, to that sort of, well, what the Greeks called kratos, the kind of physical power to prevail that the crowd has. That is what ensures that the agency, the desires, the needs of the crowd get fully reckoned with in politics. And if you just channel it all through a limited number of representatives, other, worse eruptions happen further down the line. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you both for stimulating talks, but also for unpacking this way this notion of proximity and politics. Very quickly, two notions that come to mind, and I wanted to ask you what you think. The first is deliberation, which, of course, Rousseau was a little bit worried about. And I wanted to ask both of you your view on that, to what extent deliberation is a good part of collective decision-making, to what extent Rousseau's suspicions may hold some truth. that is that it's also manipulation, is the smartest people who influence the others, those who speak better, etc., etc. The second notion that comes to mind, and I wonder what you think of it, is emergence. Because you mentioned the formation of the crowd, arguments for doing things together that are not epistemic. It's not because you aggregate many people that you get things right. Even though, right, Daniela, Aristotle is a little bit more complex on that. But I wanted to ask your thoughts about the view that when you have the formation of a crowd, there's something that happens there in terms of emergent properties, in terms of a collectivity that's more than the sum of its parts. And for that reason, of course, it doesn't represent the individuals that form it, because it's more than that. It's this kind of Durkheimian way of looking at things. What do you think of that? Does it make sense in terms of thinking about proximity?
Do you want to go first, Daniela?
I was going to ask you the same thing. You go ahead.
Okay, on deliberation. Well, obviously, both questions, as you one would expect, Nicholas, are very acute. I think one has to distinguish between deliberation of representatives and deliberation more generally. What you might call a sort of public sphere, I guess, for more general deliberation. The Rousseauvian anxiety, which I share, is that if you suppose that the deliberation will take place largely among representatives who will be rather weakly mandated or rather weakly controlled by their electorates, and indeed, as you know, perfectly familiar theory says you want representatives precisely because they're going to be deliberating in a way the general population wouldn't. As I said, that seems to me the thing that Rousseau is principally anxious about. It's true that he does say in passing that there ought not to be communication between the voters. But I think he means by that there shouldn't be things like heavy-duty political parties, what he called partial associations, where people, in a sense, predetermine their views. Deliberation of a wider kind, that is to say, exposure to the issues, it would be a rather fantastic thought to suppose that wouldn't happen. I should say, though, that my experience in both England and America in recent years has been that the public debate outside the assemblies has been of a much higher quality than the debate within it. That was particularly true, I think, during the whole Brexit confusion. But it tends to be true in the American Congress too. You know, I mean, the Senate famously prides itself on being, you know, this deliberative body. But do you actually think that any of the deliberation that goes on in the Senate is superior to the kind of argument that can take place in a much wider public setting, and on which the general public can draw? So that would be my answer to that. Emergence, yeah, well, absolutely, you're right. Though, I mean, one could put this in various ways. I mean, it could be a sort of an odd sort of psychological or covert thing that this stuff emerges in a different way. Or it could be the more straightforward thing that Daniela was talking about, that I think I would agree with, which is if we are thinking about doing something together, we have to adjust our own wishes to make sure that it comes out as something we're doing together. And I should perhaps just add on that the willingness to adjust ourselves to the rest of the population is the key democratic virtue. In other words, not to continue to resist in a radical sense if one has lost an election. If one loses an election and one wants to stay an active citizen, you go with your fellow citizens. And you do democracy with the citizens you've got. I mean, roughly. You can't expect to have different ones.
Yeah, just on the deliberation point, I agree with Richard that yeah, the public discussion, kind of the wider civil society discussion of politics, fantastic, and often much better than what you find in assemblies. Strikes me also, though, that it improves considerably when people actually feel that their opinion counts. I mean, so usually just before elections, before referendums, I mean, you have to, if you know that you're actually being required to give your answer in the form of a vote, then you take an interest, not the other way around. I mean, some people talk as though people shouldn't be allowed to vote until they've taken an interest in some things, and I think that's completely the wrong way around. What I'm interested in is kind of what I think of as like the Greek the ancient Greek notion of deliberation, where deliberation, the term bouleomai, meant coming to a decision. So it can only be done by the decision-making person, by the decision-making agent. And so that meant that in the assembly, the people that were deliberating were the listening crowd, the listening audience. They're being addressed by some speakers, not that many. But the real deliberation is going on among the people who are about to be called on to vote. And they're not really talking among themselves, interestingly. So I think, first of all, one thing I think is that a lot of deliberation goes on internally. I think discussion of politics, fantastic. This is a good thing, but we shouldn't mistake we shouldn't think of deliberation only as this thing that kind of goes on among small groups of people having a conversation. That in fact, the most important kind of deliberation is kind of weighing both sides and coming to your own decision, which means being a decision maker. So I would love that. I would love to maximize public deliberation in that sense by giving more and more people the right to take part directly in decision making. That would be a win for deliberation as I understand it and as the ancient Greeks understood it, and weirdly not as it's been predominantly understood since the 19th century, which is of course strikingly the beginning of the modern era of mass democracy. It's kind of bizarre. Actually, the notion of deliberation comes to mean something much more like just having a conversation. Just at the same time that it's obvious that the real decisions are being made by a small number of elected representatives and not really by the masses of people, even the ones who are involved in elections. So anyway, that's a cleavage there that I think a change in the notion of deliberation kind of points to an interesting change from ancient to modern democracy. And on the emergence question, yeah, it's very interesting actually. I don't know which way I go on this. I see in Aristotle a claim that coming together actually amplifies our individual qualities in a certain way. And the one that I think really makes sense is courage. I can definitely see people feeling braver, more emboldened, like when they're in the company of other people acting with them. That does make a crowd more than the sum of its parts, were those parts to have remained isolated all along. So I think there may be a way in which some of the effectiveness of crowd action comes about because people are willing to try more, be bolder. But I'm also, I also really very much like the kind of just aggregative view that what we're doing in democratic politics is we're just, we're counting heads. We're seeing who's willing to commit to what. So it's an important question and one that I haven't fully resolved myself yet.
Can I just add that in case we're slightly misleading the audience, that of course modern politics is going to have to not take place within a single space, right? I mean, clearly that's no longer possible. At least what I think, and I think Daniela would think this true, is we have to think of ourselves as if we are engaged in an activity of that kind. And that's most obvious in something like a national referendum, where we really all do go and vote together on one day, possibly. I mean, certainly in the past. So that it has this sense of real collective action, whereas many of the tendencies of modern politics are not push against even thinking of ourselves in that light. That's the key difference.
So no, I mean, I don't want to be misleading. I think that's a great vision, and I love referenda. And yet, I think that we may need more practice in seeing ourselves as one of a crowd. So I think that precisely in order to be able to think of ourselves as working together in this way, it would really help if we had mass gatherings factored into our regular political decision-making processes. So I do think there's something to be said for literally, having masses of people gather together. I think about like the 1793 Constitution of France that never happened. I mean, with these kind of, local mass assemblies that would then mandate and kind of move people up to the next level to take part in in political activity, for example. So some stratum of mass gatherings, I think, would really help us to feel like, oh, there are all these other people. So examples of times when I felt that I was one of a crowd of not that many thousands, but hearing Bernie Sanders speak, enormously encouraging. Just like great to be like, look at all these other people, they're real. I didn't realize they were real. I think there is something super important about being with other people in real life and not just imagining yourself to be one of many. And then you look at the numbers and you're like, oh, 75 million. Wow, that's really a lot actually. But I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what 6,000 means. Whereas the Athenians had that, every 10 days, if they wanted it, they could feel what it was like. So I think actually maybe the biggest crowd I've ever been a part of, they've all been music concerts, and it's wonderful. It's a reason to love festivals. Yeah. Like a Glastonbury Festival, 100,000, 200,000 other people, it's like you do get this very interesting experience of solidaristic activity that I think we really suffer from, like if you don't have it regularly. So I look around at the stadiums, the people, in so many cities have these massive stadiums, people gather to watch sporting events, and I think, every now and again they're used for election campaigns. Can't we put them to use in the interim for something political as well? Wouldn't that make a difference to the way we think about democratic politics? I think it would make a difference for me.
Thank you, Daniela. One last comment, and then I'll leave it to Dimitri for the rest of the discussion. First of all, to the public. So Daniela was the one who really insisted that we have this event as a Zoom so we can all see everyone and there's some kind of proximity. But the thing that I'm listening through both of you, even though not said explicitly, perhaps, is the importance of physical proximity. Right, the many ways of being. One can imagine different kinds of gatherings, small groups, big groups, as we have now on Zoom, or referenda that become more easy through all the advances of modern technology. But it seems to me that by listening to both of you, that there's something to be said about the actual feeling of physical proximity for democracy. Can you maybe say a little bit more if you've thought about that more concretely?
Sure. Well, should I go? Yes, obviously, and particularly at the moment, I noticed that Alex Hu on the chat asks something very similar to this. I mean, could we have something which is like this in a virtual space? I mean, my first response is virtuality is by definition representative. I mean, we're not actually together. We're not, imagine. How is a virtual crowd going to storm the Bastille, right? I mean, it can only storm the Bastille by having someone who does it on behalf of them. Can't do it themselves, right? Now, I said just now, quite a lot of politics is going to have to be as if we are in a crowd, because obviously in practice we can't be in that sort of group all the time. Though I absolutely take Daniel's point. I hadn't really thought so much about that it's important that we kind of keep a sort of education of what it's like going. So I think I would say you can do it to some degree, but you've still got to have, if you like, the paradigm as something that you're aware of and familiar with. If you imagine a world like the world that's described in the amazing pre-First World War short story by Ian Foster, which some of you probably know, called The Machine Stops. It's an extraordinary vision to have had in, I think, 1910, something like that, where everyone lives in these little cells connected by tubes, and so they don't ever get to, and one day the machine that feeds them and communicates between them stops. And the heroine sort of makes her way out of this crumbling and discovers herself rather oddly on the South Downs, which still look exactly as they're used to. But anyway, if that was how we lived, I think we would lose our sense of what it could be to do things together, properly together. And we become entirely represented. As I said, virtuality is a system of representation. I mean, Alex even uses the term representation in his note on the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I think we may need some retraining in how to act as crowds and see ourselves as part of a crowd. And again, like for me, it comes to this idea of collective agency that I don't even know if we know what things we could do if we realized like the power that we have to do things together. I mean, I think it's hard for me even to now kind of articulate the thought. Like I feel that I've become so atomized in the course of the last year with just my immediate household and like not seeing anybody else, not even having the experience of lecturing to like an actual group of 200 people and said they're all on Zoom. But I do think that maybe there's a spontaneity and there's an appreciation of us as enormously powerful en masse that we lose if we're not in the same place, at least some of the time. And I think there's like, a lot of it comes down as well to confidence and kind of respect for other people as well. Like an assurance that other people are with you, but also that they're actually different So maybe that's something else that's it's very helpful to realize that, you know, there are many things that you can't get a crowd to do. But anyway, yeah, I wish I could think of an easy kind of institutional way to make this happen. I do feel that like there's a sense of power and agency that comes with acting in concert with large numbers of people in the same place at the same time, and also being open to the ways that that can lead to maybe unexpected consequences. Because not, you know, I think we're very trained to think that those consequences will be terrifying. What you see is insurrection and riot. But I think the fact that the ancient Greeks didn't see things in that light is really significant. That something about their experience of masses of crowds, which is much broader and deeper than ours, led them to talk. This wasn't only Aristotle. I mean, he sounds like he's channeling kind of the common wisdom. They just seem to assume that crowds are often just much better behaved, much kinder, much more temperate, much more humane, and much more just than small groups of people who he said are more likely to get emotional and going to make decisions because they're angry, or single people. I think that that seems to me such an alien perspective. I mean, it's one of my favorite things that I've got from the Greeks. I think it's such an important antidote to the thought that crowds are essentially dangerous. And I basically think that's just it's a huge ideological claim. It's the claim, you know, it's the claim put about by political elites and political theorists in the era of mass democracy to really make us shrink from the powers that we have collectively. I think that's like, you know, a massive problem for modern democracy. And yeah, we need as much broadening of our imaginative horizons as possible. And we should get that, we have to get that through practice to some extent. You know, you can't get that much from reading Aristotle. We have to actually feel what it's like to be in a crowd and see what happens. So there's you know, there's some risk involved maybe, but like, I feel that, you know, most people wouldn't act appallingly badly in these mass moments, don't act appallingly badly. So we shouldn't be so afraid of the power that we have en masse. I think people recognize that there is that power, and that's why they're afraid.
Thank you, Daniel. Dimitri, do you want to?
Yes, absolutely. So we've got a couple questions that have been on the topic of, or maybe a hint of skepticism here, worries about manipulation as a problem for acting collectively. So I'm going to invite Adriana to ask her question or join the conversation. So she should be unmuted.
Hi. Hi, hello. Very nice to see you. Very nice to see you. I had a couple of questions, but part of it's already answered. It was about what exactly, if you could talk a little bit more about what exactly is it that we get by doing things together, but I think you already spoke to that. But the other part is that given all the you know, modern and contemporary worries about acting together, all the terrifying consequences and all the, you know, bad things associated with those with acting together and with mass politics. So what are there any like preconditions or things that you think of like that would be necessary for this acting together to yield the best results possible? You spoke about that we need retraining in how to act as crowds, and that there's some, you know, this confidence and power that results from being in a crowd. But given all these things that are real, you know, the problems and the worries associated with mass politics, are there any ways that you can think of that could, you know, serve as preconditions or as strategies for that to work the best possible way? Thank you, and very nice to see you.
So you're in Mexico at the moment, are you?
Yes.
Okay, lovely to see you. Right, gosh, this is a really difficult question. I mean, I think the first thing to say is, to paraphrase actually not Powell, who said all political careers end in failure, all political systems end in failure, right? I mean, I don't think we can't expect more from, we certainly can't, we can't expect an enormous amount more from democratic politics in terms of its insulation from various, you know, corrupting pressures than we do for assemblies. In fact, I would say assemblies are much more vulnerable, famously, they're much more vulnerable to all these sort of corrupting things, money, political parties, etc., etc. We're all used to that, and that's after all why there has been a move away to sortition in an attempt to solve that problem of the corruption of assemblies. But of course, if you go to sortition, you lose this other thing that I was talking about, which is our sense that we are doing this. We may be doing it through delegates, but we are doing it. And that vanishes if you have a system of sortition. So there may be no answer to the question, how in the long run do we succeed in avoiding these threats? I mean, I think that's an unreasonable question, an unreasonable demand to place upon people. Nevertheless, I mean, as we were saying, I think that things like a full public discussion tends often to have quite surprisingly beneficial results, actually. Again, the mechanisms for manipulation and corruption built into legislative assemblies. I mean, they're designed for it because of things like political parties, right? So it's not surprising that what happens is distorted in some sense. You don't get real debate. I mean, good heavens, you know, we're all perfectly used to that in the assemblies of our states. There's an open texture, and it can go in surprising ways in public debate, I think. Sure, of course, people can be manipulated, but compared with the manipulation that a political party or the donors or whatever do to the representatives gathered in assembly, I think it's actually pretty trivial, you know. Anyway, that would be my answer. What would you say, Danielle?
I'd agree. I mean, I think if you concentrate decision-making power in the hands of a few people, that is very much more open to manipulation, it seems to me. And yeah, you know, distortion, corruption over the long term, than asking a very wide swathe, everybody, asking all citizens. So again, thinking about fundamental things. I mean, I'm not suggesting that people should be asked. We don't need to have a referendum on everything, but more maybe than we currently do. It should be taken as a default, mainly because it isn't actually that easy to corrupt huge numbers of people. I mean, I take the point about, I take the worry about kind of rhetoric and manipulation seriously, but I also don't know, I don't know how, my rough hunch is that most people don't pay that much attention anyway, and that can actually be a good thing. That, if you give someone like a question and actually a limited amount of kind of airtime given over to trying to persuade them, like they'll go with their gut, which is often not actually a bad idea. Like most people do have a sense of like, oh right, does this seem like a good idea or not? I don't know. I feel like we don't try it often enough to really know. But I take the worry, and I know especially with like social media and so on, it's very hard to control misinformation, impossible to control misinformation. Fake news is a genuine, but then again, people have been complaining and worrying about fake news for a really long time. So, but I don't know, my feeling is the way to lessen this problem is to ask more people more often rather than fewer. That's, at least I feel that that's something that we could think about. You dilute some of the power of the manipulation in that way.
Could I just also add something about the purist case where we're all doing something together in single site? Here's a referendum or plebiscite. And people have this idea that they're dangerous things, and they often think about, I don't know, Weimar. You have to actually look at the facts. There weren't very many referendums in Weimar. The Nazis argued for two of them and lost. There was no referendum the Nazis won until after Hitler had taken power through a vote of the Reichstag, the Enabling Act. Weimar was not destroyed by referendums, it was destroyed by a parliament. My experience is living in Massachusetts, actually, to move from the sublime to the ridiculous, is that on the whole, the results in, as you know, these annual ballot questions have been pretty sensible, actually. I don't know of anyone which has been patently ridiculous. I mean, animals always win, fine, I mean, you expect that. But in general, they've been very sensible. And if you think about the scare stories, the Californians voting to cap taxes, people occasionally voting against gay marriage or something, they're no different from what assemblies have done in the United States on those issues. No difference at all. I doubt if you could point to any case where a state ballot came out with a decision that was dramatically different from the decisions that were being made by the elected assemblies of that state or other state. I think that we have this odd idea that referendums are sinister, based mostly on Napoleon III, actually. I think if you look at the history here, and they were kind of slightly strange referendums in all sorts of ways. Though again, you know, I think some of them were accurate. The referendum that freed up trade unions in France, for example. But on the whole, referendums have not had a very bad track record. And it's a curious fact that we continue to have this picture, that they're sinister. It kind of corresponds to what Daniela was saying about the ill-founded character of people's fears in this area.
Maybe we can invite David now to ask his question or make his comment or whatever else.
Yes, hi. So thank you to both the speakers. I have two brief questions to both for both Professor Kamek and Professor Tak. So just pick the one that you prefer. My first question ties to the one that was asked by Adriana, and it has to do with the value of political parties. So I was wondering if we agree with Eric Schacht-Snyder that modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of parties. Do you think that the institution of the recall is a way to mediate between the unavoidability of the division of labor in modern large territorial states and the need to keep our officials accountable to the people? And the second question has to do with the broader problem of proximity. So it seems to me that sometimes calls for stronger proximity happen to be weaponized by those who simply want to bypass intermediary bodies, be it the press, be it political parties or representative institutions. And so it seemed very important to me the emphasis that Nicholas placed on the meaning of physical proximity, because it helps us to distinguish that kind of proximity from the proximity that sometimes political leaders, for example, Trump, recreated when they try to communicate via Twitter with the electors directly. So the question here is, do you think that sometimes we tend to fall again into these Rousseauian anxieties about representation because we subscribe to a narrow account of representation as pure will or decision, and we should rather think of representation not as an act, but rather as a process consisting of both will and judgment, meaning the act of deciding and the process of reevaluating our decisions between elections?
Didn't you?
I'll take the one on recall, maybe.
Okay.
Just to throw in the thought that yeah, you know, anything that helps kind of control, or I guess helps representatives feel kind of under the thumb of the people that elected them, the people that they're serving. This would help, in my opinion. But I look first to the Athenians and their like amazing raft of sort of indictments, charges that they could apply to politicians. So for a start, the fact that they had audits of each official after their tenure, kind of on both ethical and sort of financial issues. They had a regularly used system of impeachment in kind of mid tenure. They had, they could take politicians to court for lying to the demos. That strikes me as a remarkably significant, potent democratic weapon. But of course, all these things worked to control politicians, to discipline politicians, in part, well, for the most part, because the judgments were being made by ordinary people too. I mean, so the fact that they had these mass courts of 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 judges, ordinary citizens acting as judges for the day, gave them like this whole extra prong to keep their political elite accountable. That, I think this is an avenue that I've been very interested in exploring and kind of continue to explore. But the significance of democratic judicial power as a means of disciplining politicians, I think it's something that modern democracy obviously lacks kind of dramatically. And it's like, I feel it's a bit like trying to do democracy with one hand tied behind your back. It's not enough just to kind of say, we won't re-elect you, or maybe we could recall you. These are pretty feeble weapons.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that's important. I mean, if you took a Rousseauvian view, I mean, Rousseau thought a lot about these issues. I mean, his view was there are different spheres here. That fundamental law, constitutional law, whatever, you know, the really important things have to be done through these direct democratic processes. Other things don't, and there'll be a sort of variation. Though, of course, his chief interest, and in a way I think this is correct, was, or chief fear, was that whatever you have as a representative body, sooner or later it's going to usurp, to use his language. And I think that, for example, the United States, the body that has usurped, it had in a way to usurp, but it nevertheless has usurped, is the Supreme Court. Because I think it's almost inconceivable there's going to be constitutional amendments in what's left of my lifetime. But an enormous amount of American public life is decided through the judgments of the court, acting, so to speak, on behalf of what I called in the book that Nicholas referred to, a sleeping sovereign. The American people who can change all these rules, but they can't any longer meet to do so. So that's an extreme case of usurpation. And obviously one can think of various practical things there, though I think really the only fundamental thing is making it easier to amend the Constitution, which after all the founders, or Jefferson certainly wanted, as we know. So there are going to be a variety of answers here. But I think that the thing that makes us feel our politics is ours, so to speak, is that at least at the important levels, we're doing it, right? We're not leaving that to representatives, which is why, as I said, I favor constitutional referendums. And then it's a sliding scale, you know, put the question of whether you can have greyhound racing to a popular vote, maybe not, I don't know. But actually assisted suicide, which was thrown out by the electors of Massachusetts, that may be the sort of really fundamental issue which should be put to a popular vote. It shouldn't be left in the hands of representatives.
Right, so I think I'll just see some prerogative and ask perhaps a final question. But so the master worry, you might think, with big crowds of people is always that it produces this kind of crowd mentality or mob mentality or this sort of homogenization. But so I have maybe you'd sympathize with this. There's a sort of counterintuitive thought about that. Anyone who's been in these big, large crowds is used to hearing, when the minute you're in one of these, you hear all sorts of people saying all sorts of things on scales from wacky to exactly what you believe. So might you think that that kind of large crowd dynamic would breed some kind of tolerance, actually? When you see words written on Twitter, you don't have any of the kind of empathetic reaction that you might have when you hear someone who basically agrees with you 5 feet over screaming it. And that might be bad, that might normalize things that ought not to be normalized, but it also might breed a certain kind of political toleration. So.
Yeah, well, that's the point that Daniela made, isn't it, Daniela? You were just saying exactly that. Yeah.
I agree completely, yeah. And I also think almost becoming aware of the differences also helps us to zoom in on the things that we have in common. I mean, so yeah, exactly. You'd be like, wow, that kind of wacky person, but I can go with them this much of the way, so we can go forward on that basis. Great.
Yeah.
There's yes, I think it would build real kind of empathy and respect and toleration, or I hope, at least that's my hope. But I think that's right. I think that's the right way to think about it. Crowds are not homogenous in the way that people assume. And I think they do make you aware of your differences from one another just as much as you kind of think we're undertaking this collective action, but we're not the same. We have different views on things, but we can join together doing this thing. Great. Yeah,
and famously, people on Twitter, which they wouldn't have saying to someone when they're there. I mean, that's the weirdness of these mediums. That again, they're sort of they've been evacuated of real proximity again. I mean, actual sense that you're talking to a real person, and the physical proximity there is important. I think you barely even get it on telephone. In my experience, you certainly don't get it on social media. As I said, it's all this, it's this tremendous remoteness of human experience through the screen, and that really matters. It matters psychologically. It matters politically.
So we're running out of time. I want to say just one comment on the way this is ending on the notion of empathy and moderation. Our next event, about which we'll email you soon, is about proximity and ethics, and we'll be examining precisely the notion of empathy or sympathy, as Adam Smith wanted to call the idea, the question of whether or not bringing people together creates a moderation through sympathy, whether proximity is important and whether it's good for ethics, or whether it's it creates biased ethical judgments. So more on that in the next event. Thank you all for doing such an amazing work in unpacking this notion of proximity in politics and getting through notions that were kind of contained there, discussing referenda, physical proximities versus virtual presence, representation versus direct democracy, a power to convene and who makes the crowd and what happens in crowds and wisdom. Want to end there for now and say goodbye, unless our director Greg Nash wants to say a final word.
No, I don't want to say a final word. I'm overwhelmed by the brilliance of the speakers. And I'm so honored that I had a chance to listen in. So my gratitude, admiration.
Thank you all very much, and to be continued.
Gosh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.